All right, what up, y'all? Hey, my name is Cooper Napoli. This is Unracked. This is a live conversation series from Bridge Athletic, where top coaches break down the training systems, methods, and philosophies that drive performance at the highest level. Each episode takes you inside a specific approach, how it's built, how it's applied, and how it evolves under real world conditions. Um, Let us know where you're from in the chat here, and we'll kind of get going into Todd's introduction here in a minute. So let it rip. All right. Today's guest has lived and breathed performance at the highest levels of sport, business, and the scientific community. Todd Anderson walked on to the Michigan State football team and later got an opportunity in the NFL with the Rams organization. Todd actually hired me at an Equinox location in Chicago in 2017. Personally, I can say that his leadership was one of the primary reasons that our club got Club of the Year, and his ability to foster, I think, just really that community element. Culture is second to none. And yeah, just love the dude to death. Over the years, it's really been a pleasure to watch him dive into the sleep space with some intensity and all around sick vibes that he brings to everything he does. So, Todd, welcome to the show, man.
Good to see you, brother.
Yeah. So let's start with I want to hear a story. I think, one of my favorites that you've told me in the past is kind of your walk-on story at Michigan State. I specifically kind of want to tune into the moment you found out that you were walk-on. I always see those videos on ESPN and think it's you know, just exciting for everyone to hear.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, my story is, kind of like the real life Rudy in a sense, but I grew up, being a Michigan State fan. My dad went to Michigan State, was a hardcore football fan to the point where he even helped send out recruiting letters in the football office. So I grew up going to those games, but even my senior year of high school, I had no offers. Didn't even have a Division II offer. Was pretty set on going to a Division III school to or Adrian College to play football and probably baseball. And then in May of my senior year of high school, right? So I'm going to school in 4 months, 5 months, whatever. Uh, Michigan State's offensive coordinator walked in the door and to my high school, and I got called down to the office, and I looked at his shirt and did like a triple take, thinking this guy's there must be another school that has like the Spartan helmet. It's a popular logo, and no. So it turns out early in the summer, I happened to go to a 7-on-7. I didn't even play tight end. I just jumped in because someone didn't show up, and I had been working super hard in the weight room. Got a lot more athletic, made a couple plays, and the head coach of the biggest school in Michigan happened to see me and recommended it. So the chances that it even happened were insane. And I remember Coach D'Antonio just gave me a call and offered me like a preferred walk-on spot in the fall, and I made a pros and cons list with my parents.
Hmm.
That was like Adrian College because it wasn't a for sure thing. I mean, I was so out of my element. It wasn't even like I never even say it's a dream come true because it wasn't even like in the realm of possibilities. That's like me being like, I'm going to be the CEO of Microsoft, right? Like it
Yeah.
wasn't even a thought. And I made this pros and cons list between Adrian and Michigan State trying to walk on, and it was almost dead even, except that the last one was, and we still had this list, was will you regret not trying it? And I think it's kind of been like my every decision, every big decision I've made up until this point. That's kind of the same question I ask myself, and that's kind of like I think that's a good way to approach life. It's just like the worst thing that could happen is when you're 80 years old, you have these regrets of not trying or going after something. So it's kind of been my mantra ever since then. But the actual point where I got a scholarship was a little underwhelming because we literally were like getting ready for our game and our coach just called us in and told me. But he's a pretty chill guy. He's pretty low key. But yeah, dream come true. And like I would have been happy playing one play there. When I went there and ended
Yeah.
up, after you show up and you get yourself around it. At the beginning, it was horribly hard, but I think it's similar to life. You get around a lot of really successful people, or someone with big titles, or this, that, and the other thing, and it's not about when you spend more time around them, you start to realize you're the same as everybody else. And it's no different with performance. You get around people, you start to realize like these people aren't, supernatural. They're just human
Hmm.
beings, and you adapt. And so I think initially it can be a shock to the system, but eventually you adapt. Ended up being a starter, and you know, I couldn't have been it couldn't have been a better, storybook ending for us. Minus losing the Big Ten championship game in the last play. That was pretty tough, but that was
Yeah,
it.
that's not an easy one, I'm sure. Well,
Yeah.
cool, man. And I guess, I love you talking about you having these big moments where you kind of filter, regretting not doing it through that. How did that play into, you founding Dream Recovery?
Yeah, I mean, really, like I'm sure with a lot of people on here, like my obsession with strength conditioning in full actuality was body composition, aesthetically driven. I was an overweight kid. I was chubby. Started, buying the Muscle and Fitness mags and just became obsessed with working out for that reason of just building confidence. And I think that's totally fine for people to be honest about. But that's where everything kind of stemmed from because I got to Michigan State and I felt like I had to I just became obsessed with like research and trying to learn things before everybody else to get an edge because I had to have an edge. And I think that's where, the sleep stuff started popping up. And then as I progressed through, I've worked with a bunch of athletes, training, all different settings. But at the end of the day, like the more I learned about sleep, the more I realized it was this thing at the time no one was talking about it. It kind of is the foundation which all these performance buckets lie on or rest on. And I think, over the last 10 years, things have evolved quite a bit, but it wasn't being communicated in a way that related to athletes. At least not to me. We would talk about sleep and it was a discussion, but it wasn't relevant or it didn't seem relevant to the goals I was trying to achieve. So that was kind of how it stemmed as I started. I spent time with some sleep doctors, went back to school, took as many courses as I could, did some internships, and then started speaking, not necessarily to say I know everything, but more of a relatability perspective. When I go talk to sports teams, college pro teams or whatever, it's about, taking the science and communicating it in a way that's relatable to guys and they actually care about. And that could be different for every team. But I think that was the miss for a while. I think people knew the importance, but I'm sure everybody agrees over the last 5 years the importance of sleep, the pendulum has swung quite the other way, which is cool to see. There's some negatives that come with that, but like it's been pretty cool. And so basically, all this evolved from a business perspective. I still am passionate about education. The goal is to educate, and then it's just to have once people are educated and they look or they might be seeking out certain products to help support their sleep environment, that we have the best products. But at the end of the day, the more people are focused on sleep, the more people are intentional about their sleep environment, the better the world's going to be. And so that's the
Yeah.
focus. It was the company, there was a product of me doing these talks and talking to teams and businesses and getting asked for recommendations on products.
Mm. That makes a ton of sense. And you talk about kind of the intentionality behind sleep and, can you unpack that just a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think like anything else, sleep can be a skill, and I think that it's something that, especially in younger people and athletes, it was often an afterthought. And for most people, it seemed like our schedule took up our time. We put in things that were important, and then sleep got the leftover. So I think just the intentionality is kind of flipping that upside down, where we're understanding like sleep may be the most important piece of your day, especially from a performance perspective. Well, let's schedule that in first and make everything else fit. And for most people, when they start prioritizing and being intentional, it's very doable. But the initial shock of that or the initial shift might be one you have to chip away at, or it's challenging.
Yeah, well, I guess let's talk through the perfect day of setting yourself up for sleep. How does that
Yeah.
look?
Yeah, and I think right now there like that question gets asked a lot, and I think that a lot of people are seeking this perfect algorithm or this perfect routine, but like anything, whether it's a joint or your sleep routine, being rigid is usually a negative, right? And so
Mhm.
with anything, it's about creating a routine that works for you, but yet is adaptable. It isn't overly rigid, where it's as soon as you're taking out of that element, everything falls to pieces. Because with a lot of athletes, and particularly, there's travel, there's road games, things happen. Like you have to adjust, and actually adaptability, I would say, is actually one of the biggest assets to an athlete. So I think the biggest thing is consistency, right? 7 days a week, wake time, bedtime. And I know that's not always possible, but that really is the most impactful. And when you look at the data, staying within that 30-minute mark of wake time and bedtime, once you get outside that 30-minute mark, it's pretty predictable changes outside every 5 minutes. You're going to have changes in like your resting heart rate variability, different biometrics. are impacted pretty substantially the further away you get from that. So I think, if there's one thing out of all this stuff, it's consistency. Now, the process and to get to consistency could be different, right? Like we talked about routine and bedtimes and wake times. But, if the ability of the athlete or the person is there, take full advantage of it. And I think that also comes with being able to communicate with coaching staffs, right? Like I think probably in this space, strength conditioning space, people are innovating and they're looking at the data coming out and willing to change things. But I think with coaching, and every sport is culturally different. Like we're talking about communicating to the athletes, but sometimes it's communicating to the coaching staff appropriately about why they should value this and why it's okay to adjust your schedule to give the athletes the best opportunity to have consistency in their sleep schedule.
Yeah, that's what I guess. So, what is the impact of nailing this from a performance perspective? And then maybe we can dive into the negative impact when you don't.
Yeah, you think about impact, and I think it's hard because it's like anything is super dependent on the situation, the load, different stimulus. But I think for athletes and for coaches, I don't think people think about the subconscious impact, right? I think people think about being tired, not having energy, not being motivated, but the real impact from sleep comes from like subconscious reactions, right? When we look at injury rates, in comparison to hours of sleep, and we see pretty drastic decreases, even from the difference of 7 hours to 8 hours, 8 hours to 9 hours of sleep consistently each night. Like those are impacts on the brain that are happening without people realizing it. And the reason that's important is because I think there's this toughness element of athletics in particular that people think you can out tough being tired, right? We've all been there. You wake up, you don't sleep well, and you grit through it. But you can't out tough things like your reaction time, your memory, your ability to communicate, like emotional intelligence, things like that. Those are all impacted by sleep, and those are things that you can't just like grind through. And so I think sometimes like that's when we talk about communicating sleep, I think making them understand like, it's going to have impacts regardless, no matter how tough you are, no matter how much you get acclimated to a schedule and being underslept. It's going to have an impact, and it's going to have an impact in ways that you can't really control, right? And so using that as something that's powerful, using that is also a way to motivate yourself to commit to it and give you confidence if that's something you're doing day in and day out.
Mm,
And I
cool.
think right now it's still pretty old school where people associate energy with sleep, which isn't wrong. But when we're talking about from an athlete's perspective, like when you're thinking about milliseconds of differences making the difference between winning or losing, dropping a pass, catching a pass. And, they did the study at Stanford with start time. And, on average, 0.15 second slower time off the blocks for swimmers, right? And that seems that doesn't seem anything. That doesn't seem like it's a crazy number. But when you think about, just to give you perspective, my wife was an Olympic swimmer. She lost the gold medal by 7/100ths of a second, right? So you could argue if she had a bad night's sleep that night, that's the difference between a win or a loss. And I think that's also a sport where their like entire focus is coming off the blocks and their start, and that's a pretty substantial impact. So just imagine if you kind of expand that out to other sports that are reactionary, like basketball or football, or something that takes hand-eye coordination on the fly. Those minor differences probably have impacts far beyond what we even can realize at this point.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I know we have a bunch of it looks like tactical guys kind of in the chat here. Talk me through like, kind of the real negatives here of that real long, let's talk long-term sleep loss. I think that
Yeah.
might be an interesting thing to dive into because that's kind of the nature of a lot of deployments for folks.
I think the I mean, first off, that's one of the hardest things to deal with. When your schedules are all over the place, night shift workers, like that's very difficult to overcome. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I've seen out there. But, I think the real long-term negatives come from that the deep sleep cycles, right? Like, you know, up until 2019, people, scientists didn't really understand what was going on, but they were able to do the first live MRIs on a brain, and when they found in that slow wave sleep, there's actually this cerebral spinal fluid that's pumping. It's literally pumping and clearing out the brain of some of those proteins, those beta amyloids, and some of the tau proteins, things that cause neurodegenerative diseases. And so the issue with that sometimes is in order to progress through these different sleep cycles, or to get to these different sleep cycles, it's a progression, right? And so, we start in the lighter stages, we get to our deep sleep, REM sleep, and it repeats. And so when your normal wake time and bedtime is kind of all over the place, or it's in a different time zone, or it's at night, your sleep tends to become much more fragmented, and it's more difficult. You have to be much more intentional, like I said, to make sure you're progressing through these sleep cycles, because they all play a different role. But I think what we're finding out is that mechanism of the flushing mechanism and that slow wave sleep, from a long-term perspective, seems like it's probably the culprit for a lot of the issues people are dealing with.
Wow. Does this tie into like any diseases?
Yeah, I mean,
Like that
Alzheimer's,
can.
dementia, yeah, any of the neurodegenerative stuff, just that, those plaques tend to build up and
Mm,
cause communication issues. So I mean, it's a double-edged sword, I think, too, though, right? Like with Alzheimer's for a while, I would say it kind of felt like this thing that you just hope you didn't get. And now, the more we learn,
yeah.
there's some proactive things we can do, and sleep is one of those things that you really want to make sure that you're dialed into, especially if people in your family have it. There's some genetic testing you can do to see if you're specifically more susceptible to that. But I mean, I look at it as a positive, because I think it's one. I don't know if anyone's ever dealt with someone with dementia or Alzheimer's, but it's horrible to witness. And so just knowing there are some things that could potentially be helpful, and there's movement, and there's starting to be an understanding of that stuff, is a big positive in my mind.
Yeah, dude, that's massive. And good things to call out there. I think where my mind's kind of going next, especially, we see the negative side effects, we see the positive things. Like, what is the most critical aspect to communicate to athletes? And let's, obviously, some of us work probably with a lot of Gen Pop, some of us work with collegiate athletes. You kind of get the full gambit of personality types. You have
Yeah,
your booze hounds, you got your pot smokers, you've got,
yeah, yeah.
people who are super locked in, like,
I've actually been called into teams, and they're like, we need you to talk to the team about sleep, but we got too many people smoking weed, and that's what we need to focus on. So yeah, I totally get that. You know, and I think this actually relates back to what I said about my story, is like the reason I got into working out was the aesthetic side, right? And I think that's the important piece, because if you go in and you're talking to someone that's 18 years old, and however you're working with them, you start talking about longevity and dementia and Alzheimer's, like they might listen, but the chances that they're fully bought in is probably low. And so I think
extremely low. Yeah.
I'm all about use the leverage you have, right, to try to get to the reason why someone is working with you in whatever capacity it is. And the cool thing about sleep that's unique is you can relate sleep to literally any goal out there. Unless your goal is to like die young, then it's probably going to work, right? Like you can relate it to anything. And it becomes really easy to start connecting the dots of like relevant data, relevant science, and getting them excited about what they're trying to achieve. And I think that's what it's about, is just like anything, carving out the connection between the goals and the why, and sleep. It's actually pretty easy to do now. Now it is. I would say, the last 10 years, the data and the research has grown exponentially. 10 years ago, it was actually wild. I mean, I remember back in the early 2000s, there was a couple studies correlating decreases in testosterone to sleep deprivation. But as far as like actual like tick for tack performance outcome studies, it was tough. So it's cool now that you have the information. I think, use what they're excited about, use what they care about, leverage that. And that's the way to approach it. And at some point in their life, they're going to understand that other things are impactful. But I think it's about building those habits early on, because especially as kids, sleep habits linger with you. I think one of the most valuable things my parents gave me was a bedtime, and I don't think it was necessarily on purpose, but I always had a bedtime, and I kind of had like a wind down routine, and I didn't realize it. But those, when you're a kid, you're so pliable and moldable. I think those things carry on. So, use what they're excited about. And it's okay if it's not necessarily the thing that you're worried about or you're trying to impact, but it just gets them. It's about getting them there. It's not how they get there.
Love that. I love that. And I guess like when you're in front of a collegiate football team,
Yep.
right? What are the things that you in particular are focusing on with that set of guys?
I think, especially football, I think one, I think that acknowledging the difficulty goes a long way, right? Like to sit up there and say, you need to be sleeping this amount. This is why. I think like understanding their lifestyle is important. Understanding the challenges, the demands, the social demands, the school, everything they're going through. I think so. Setting the stage and the relatability of, listen, I mean, for me, it's helpful. I've been in your shoes, but I think really understanding what the challenges are, because if you just get up there and talk about consistency and don't relate it to their schedule, it's probably not going to go well. So what I try to do is first set the stage there, and then set the stage of what I'm going to relate to. Of if you're like getting to the NFL, for most collegiate football teams, 80% of the guys there, that's their plan, is to get to the NFL. So trying to relate back to that in every single thing I talk about, whether it's routine, meal timing, light exposure, all these things, just trying to always bring it back to that singular purpose of increasing your performance on the field, getting you to the NFL. And then you tend to have some pretty good buy-in, and people learn. And then sometimes one of the, you talked about THC and alcohol. That's a big concern, especially for college. I say it seems like, from my experience, football teams and basketball teams have a little bit more prevalent, especially football. But sometimes, depending on the situation, having the coaches out of the room and having some real conversations about substances, like guys are going to drink, guys are going to smoke. Hopefully not, but they probably will. And so going through the data, explain to them, if you're going to do it, which I'm not telling you not to or to do it. You make the decision, but this is what's going to happen. Like this is what's going on in your body. These are the negative impacts. Relating it back to the stuff we already talked about with their long-term aspirations. And then, when you can try to monitor a team, you can try to hold a team accountable, discipline a team, control their schedule. But when you educate a team on something, and they listen, like it's actually incredible. The buy-in that some teams really get, and it's different for everyone. And some teams respond really well, but I think educating is really important. And then I think also, my ideal setup is actually talking to the coaches as well separately, because coaches, you want to talk about some poor sleep habits, college football coaches especially. The culture is wild. I'll just say that it is a wild culture, especially during the season. But even relating it to them, when you think about decision making and communication and emotional regulation, like those are super valuable for a college football coach. But have they ever connected the dots between their sleep schedule and their ability to
Mhm.
be a leader and a coach? And I would doubt that. So I love to have a private session with the coaching staff. And then it's fine if the coaches are in there, depending on the team. But if somebody's, for certain things like substances, sometimes it's nice to have conversations. And then also just opening up for like one-off. Some guys aren't going to necessarily raise their hand and ask questions, but just trying to, create enough of a relationship to them feel comfortable.
Yeah, no, that's really important. I think there can be a lot of preconceived notions about sleep, and especially at all these different levels, especially when you have multiple generations in one room trying to work towards
Yeah.
one common
The
thing. And
coaches sometimes too, like if you think about a college team, pro teams are a little different, but a college team, like a kid could have the best intentions in the world with their sleep, but if the schedule is not conducive to that, it's going to be really hard. So sometimes it's almost like the trickle down effect. If you can get to the coaches and get their buy-in,
Mhm.
it can be really helpful. And I think
Yeah.
then all of a sudden scheduling starts to be thought about in a different light. Lifts, it's about having the best lifts, right? It's not, I think the whole like trying to control guys are going to go out. Putting a 5 a.m. lift there probably isn't going to change that. Everyone's probably seen that. So I think it's about, all right, even like let's try to, let's educate them so they make the decision of going out. But regardless, allowing them to sleep a little bit more, and if they have the flexibility, having the best lift. That's the goal.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, because at the end of the day, like performance is contingent on actually going out there and executing,
Yeah,
right? Not
100%.
how tired you were when you executed.
Absolutely.
Interesting, cool. I want to kind of loop back around to the alcohol and THC stuff. I think that at least personally, like no matter what group I've worked with, and this includes my high school kids, love them to death. But there's it. I think that that's one of the hardest things to get them to change the thought on. So could you just share some of that practical, like
Yeah.
alcohol, THC, what's going on, and what are the negative repercussions? Not trying to scare anyone, but I definitely think that like to me that's where in my personal life that's where I got was like okay I can't keep doing this stuff.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's hard because I think the effects of the two are relatively similar, and for the most part, they reduce the amount of REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, pretty substantially, which is kind of like our mental reset, right? Like that's when we were able to regulate our emotions, our to memory consolidation, and we're able to maintain balance throughout the days, I would say, from a psychological perspective.
Hmm.
But what's interesting, I don't know if everyone else has experienced this, but THC usage, I think with some of the laws changing, has increased pretty dramatically. I think what's hard is one, like THC has been, I think, socially kind of like co- connected with sleep, like as a positive. And I think this is like, there's no, this is all just my opinion, but like with some of the law changes, there's been a lot of push to like promote the positives of THC, and some of them can be for certain people. But at the end of the day, long-term usage, you look at the brain scans and the different like long-term outcomes of THC chronic usage. It's not good stuff. Like it's pretty substantial. So I think you're overcoming this cultural shift of like THC is good for recovery and sleep. And weirdly, like the only time in which it seems to like kind of be positive is the first night or two. If someone doesn't use THC, it can promote a little bit deeper sleep, it seems. But after that, it's kind of net negative, and they don't get as much REM sleep. And then alcohol is similar, except usually towards the morning time, you metabolize the alcohol and your brain tries to make up for it, and you go into these like bigger REM cycles. But regardless, like the architecture of your sleep is disrupted in both. And the other part is they're both sedating, right? So when you think about sleep, I don't think people understand it's about like the progression of sleep cycles and consistent architecture of your sleep, not just like when you fall asleep and how hard it feels like you're falling asleep. Like when you wake up from alcohol, a lot of times it feels like you were sleeping really deep because, like I said, that first half of the night, your brain's deprived of this REM sleep, and after it clears it, you're able to like try to make up for it. Like you'll see that with alcoholics when they stop drinking. Sometimes they'll have to take medication because they have crazy vivid dreams. REM sleep is when the majority of our dreams take place. So similarly, in the morning, sometimes, it's convincing that you're having this better night's sleep. And so I think understanding like it can also create a pretty, a substance abuse cycle of, you have this sleep that's helping you regulate your emotion. Oftentimes people turn towards alcohol when they're having they're emotionally going through something. And then all of a sudden, like you're eliminating the type of sleep that's like directly helping that issue. And so it creates this kind of cycle. And so I think again, like relating it to some type of you know goal that they're trying to achieve is what you want to focus on, and them understanding there's a difference between being sedated, falling asleep, and having quality sleep. Like quality sleep is essentially like our natural rhythms, and as soon as those rhythms are adjusted or impacted by a substance, there's going to be some outcomes. There's a reason that we progress through those cycles the way we do, and as soon as you start, you know, getting bigger proportions of different types of sleep, it's going to have an impact.
I love the
I always
point
think about
on
like I always
yeah.
compare sleep cycles to like instruments in a band. And so like, the guitar, it has a certain role, but if you have a bad drummer, you can't make up for the drummer with more guitar. Or if you have a
Mhm.
bad guitar or got a bad guitar player, the drummer can't make up for that. And so it's similar when you think about like your deep sleep cycles and your REM sleep. They play different roles. It's not about getting one versus the other. It's about having these progressions of sleep cycles through the night. And when you start throwing in substances, um, that flow gets thrown off.
I see. Yeah. I mean, I love what you said about the almost like the rhythm there, right? You
Yeah.
you want to have these things happening every day and replicating, and you want
Yep.
that song, to have its ebbs and flows
Yeah.
and kind of reach on that level. So I mean, I feel like we've talked about kind of the negative side of things, and like having a shitty guitar in there always sucks.
Yeah.
But I think let's talk about like when this band is rocking and rolling. I think on a very practical level, I think from my perspective, supplements and routine are like two major ways you can kind of help yourself. So whichever you want to dive into first, but I think it'd be
Yeah.
useful to dive into like what good, great, elite actually looks like for those things.
Yeah. And so I think that's a great place to start is defining what elite sleep looks like or good sleep. And I might argue the point that there isn't a difference between those things of good and great and elite because I think what we're running into right now is this obsession with perfecting sleep, and this is on the kid, a lot of the athletes that are a little more, you know, I don't want OCD is not the word, but the ones that were willing to do
Mhm.
whatever it takes, anything. The coach says jump, and they say high, how high, and we call it like an orthosomniac, like the obsession with ortho coming from the Greek word like to fix, and so
Yep.
um, I think I think that what's hard is I think with athletes in particular, anybody you think about endurance or aerobic capacity, strength, power, all these things. For the most part, the better it is, the better they are as an athlete, and you can
Mhm.
continue to get better in most of these things for a relatively long time, and that's usually what happens throughout someone's career. When it comes to sleep, it's really about like the minimal effective dose, right? It's about how do I get the optimal quality? How do I get the optimal quantity and consistency, having the most minimal impact to the athlete's life, right? So,
Mhm.
and what I mean by that is somebody is getting great sleep, they feel great, they're performing at a high level, they have great consistency. At layering on all these like hacks and supplements and different routine oriented things, like it's not a linear progression where your sleep can get infinitely better. It's like if it's good, check the box and move on. Don't continue to focus on that because oftentimes like people will go down a bad path, and the more you're not going to overthink yourself into better sleep. Sleep at the end of the day is the ultimate form of peace. And think about the lower stress people. If you honestly, if you look around, people having purpose in their life, they have good relationships, they feel like they're doing the right things, tend to be better sleepers. And that's because anxiety naturally rises through the day. And so you know making sleep something now they're anxious about, they're worried about, they're concerned about in an unhealthy way, it can happen relatively quickly with an athlete that's really, really motivated. And so I think that the best routine is honestly the one that works. Like it's the one, it could be brushing their teeth at a certain time. It could be supplements. It doesn't matter. But I think that the best routine is the one that works. The one thing, we do harp on is like the first thing we'll go to is just is the control of light. I think the first thing people want to do is jump to supplements, melatonin, all these different routine oriented things. But oftentimes, with especially melatonin production, people's bodies respond really well to the absence of light. You start producing melatonin and create a great routine just through controlling the light. And what I mean by that is like just creating a continuum from their living space to their bedroom. Not just, the bedroom's a sacred spot, but you can't have all the lights on in the living room from 5 to 10 p.m., and then walk in your bedroom at 10:05 and expect your body to respond. And so I think it's about, progressing things throughout the night. And you can use tools like blue light glasses, whatever. And even just like candle. I love candles, like candles. When I talk about like a low impact and I don't know, it kind of sets the vibe for the night.
Mhm.
But I think intentionality with the control of light is something, especially with the younger population, that's often missed, and that's usually the first place we'll go if somebody starts to have a little bit of difficulty. And it's also like minimal impact. It's not like I don't think it drives too much attention in a negative way, and you're not like too dialed into the data. It's more of a relaxation thing, and it's something it's easy to do, and it doesn't feel like they're a science experiment.
Yeah, Really interesting. I think the light exposure is one I've heard a lot about, and the obviously the sleep mask and blackout
Yeah.
curtains and all those things. Like, what, in your opinion, is the optimal sleep environment?
That's you know, it's hard. Like, cause I give you the answer like on paper, the temperature and all this stuff, but I'm so big on the sleep mask for athletes, and the reason is a couple of things. And if you haven't used a sleep mask, uh, then it's going to be hard for you to like it's one of these things where you got to try. But the sleep mask one, it's cheap and it's easy to take. You can replicate the environment wherever you go, right? And so for an athlete, I think that's a massive win. You're all over the place, and no matter what circumstance, whether you're in the World Cup or the Olympics or you're just getting ready for practice, you can have a relatively similar environment. And the piece I think for athletes for right now that's extremely powerful is like the psychological trigger of like this feeling of when I put this thing on, it's now time to go to bed. And when you get in that routine, it's subtle, but it's super effective. And we've found with athletes in particularly, obviously phones are a big component nowadays. Well, that's a pretty easy solution. If they can get in the routine of using a mask, all of a sudden the phone usage has to stop at some point because it's pretty wild when you look at how many kids are literally on their phone, on Snapchat, on TikTok, till they pass out, like with their phone in their hand. And so getting them bought into that can be super powerful. So I always lean to that because when you look at like controlling the light in a bedroom, blackout curtains are really difficult, right? And hard to replicate. You can't really take those with you on the road.
Mm.
And so that's one of the few things you can use wherever you're at. And so I always like that's usually my first recommendation as far as being able to have an impact no matter what situation you're in.
Got it.
And I think that's the name of the game, right? Like the worst case scenario is you get used to something at home, all of a sudden you're thrown into the competition, and then the day before you're in a completely different environment. And then
Yeah,
earplugs. I mean, earplugs are honestly, or white noise is a pretty useful tool when I think like proactively as an athlete, just because like the first night syndrome is basically considered the first night when you're in a new environment. One, your brain is very aware of new environment smells and can sense that. And so that first night, you're about 50% more sensitive to sound. So if you think
wow.
about like a lot of teams, a lot of teams can't afford to travel out multiple days before the competition. So if you're out one day before, if you're using earplugs or white noise at home, it can be something that reduces the impact of different sounds in a hotel or different environment that could disrupt you that you're going to be more sensitive to in a new environment. So I think that's something to consider if you have a team that travels quite a bit.
That's really interesting. I didn't know that about your 50% more,
Yeah.
I
But it makes
guess.
sense. Think about like from an
Yeah.
evolutionary perspective, if you're sleeping somewhere new, like being alert, a little bit more alert, like, for predators or whatever it may be.
Every I go camping a good bit. Every first night sucks, no matter what. I'm trying to
Yeah.
crack the code, but maybe that's just it. Maybe it's just because I am like, whoa, like
Yeah,
more
probably.
higher on alert. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I appreciate all this, man. This is huge stuff. I want to make sure we get into the um, you know, attendee Q&A.
Yeah.
Feel like there's been a lot of questions getting asked, so I'm just gonna kind of rifle through
No
and
doubt.
let's let it rip. Let's see. Okay. Do you have any specific ways to manage sleep difficulties and track sleep patterns?
Meaning like the data of sleep patterns. I mean, so I see a couple wearable questions on here. So
Yeah.
like I am a partner, full disclosure, I'm a partner of Aura Ring. Um, and from a pure accuracy perspective, from the data I've seen, they're slightly more accurate with the sleep cycles, but and whoops right there. But to be fair, we're talking 72, 75% accuracy here for sleep cycles. So, that's not a number where I'd be willing to like bet my career on analyzing with. And so I think,
Mhm.
the cycles can be fine unless there's something that really jumps out, like they're getting the crazy low amount of a particular amount or type of sleep. If they feel good and the sleep quantity and consistency are there, like that's usually what would use the trackers for. That's really the use case. And I think the other thing is the relationship with the sleep trackers. Like the as an athlete, like you do not want to wake up, check your sleep score, check your readiness score, and let that number dictate how you feel that day. And we see that quite a bit. And so,
Mm.
depending on the athlete, sometimes and Whoop has a feature you can do this. Other ones have features where you can actually turn off some of those readiness scores because as much as we're talking about the impact of sleep, at the end of the day, part of being an athlete is getting up and getting it done and performing regardless of the situation at hand. Like even in practice, right? So, I think sometimes they're misleading, and some of the algorithms are interesting, right? Like so and I think I don't want to say it paints the wrong picture, but I've dealt with this quite a bit. So like Whoop is a 0 to 100, green is 66 and above, yellow's in the middle, red is in the bottom. But it's an adjusting algorithm, right? So your biometrics, if you had a 99% recovery, if you had those same biometrics every single day, that 99% will slowly move closer and closer to 50% because it's adjusting to your norms. And so realistically, the majority of your days should be in the yellow, right? That's in your like, in the median zone of standard deviation. And so that's a normal good day to perform. And so I think sometimes that's misleading. That should be the norm, and you don't want an athlete to let that dictate how they feel, and vice versa. Like the number, like at the end of the day, you don't want athletes waking up obsessively checking their sleep score and letting that impact them on the field one way or the other. I think there's a healthy way to do it, and what I love is like using it as a reflective tool, right? After a month, and you have you track some substantial changes in behaviors, routine. Yeah, it could be like training cycles, competition, and you look at like maybe some of the things you did in your sleep, and you look at the changes over time of biometrics and consistency in sleep, and then you make changes based on that in a reflective way. And then you reflect again and see how the impact of those changes made. I think that's a really healthy, useful way to look at it. Um, but some athletes can handle having that data at hand, and some athletes, can be detrimental. I think it's person
Yeah.
to person for a lot of people.
Yeah, it almost sounds like a sleep journal is helpful for anyone and everyone to do.
Yes, yeah, yeah,
And leaning into the data for the right personality, great. For the wrong personality, it's going to trigger their neurotic behavior and attitude
yeah,
around
yeah.
it, which
And there's a lot of that.
not good.
There's there's quite a few athletes like that. So
Yeah, to say the
yeah,
least.
I think awareness is a really powerful tool. So when you think about journaling and just asking people, what time did you go to bed? What time did you wake up? Rate the
Hmm.
quality of your sleep. Did anything stress you out that kept you awake? Like even those four questions, that's bringing awareness of what's most important, right? If you're asking the questions, the assumption is that is the most important things, and that's what you want. Like you want them to think my bedtime, my wake time are important, and then thinking about stress management. I think that's probably one of the most overlooked aspects of sleep is um, stress management for things outside of sleep. Like a lot of times, stressors and psychological stressors are disguised as sleep issues, right? Like a
Hmm.
kid can't sleep, but when you really dive into it and you have them talk to somebody and they talk to someone in a clinical setting, it really becomes a stress management issue, and they're carrying a huge burden or load or whatever, and they can't manage their stress like that. I think like that would normally be disguised as a sleep issue. So I think being proactive with um, you know, the stress side, like the psychological situation is for the athlete is important. And so I think if you're going to ask questions in journal, it's like you want to ask questions that that shine awareness on the right things.
Love that. Love that.
And I would say data is secondary to that.
Okay. Yeah, and I think that makes a ton of sense. Next one here is going to be, can you talk on the difference between THC and CBD for sleep? Is there any, kind of pertinent things to take into account there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, pretty substantial. THC, like I said, there's a good amount of data on that. It seems to be net negative, especially chronic users for that REM sleep. And you'll see that a lot if you ever talk to people who have used THC chronically, they'll talk about how they never really dream. And not that dreams like that's not a good data point, but it is we dream in our REM sleep, and a lot of times they have crazy dreams when they get off it. And
Hmm.
so yeah, pretty net negative. CBD is one of those things where it's it kind of seems neutral right now. Too early to tell. There, you'll see some stuff that's relatively positive, some that doesn't, say too much. So I would say I would put it as a neutral, or you know, there's still work to be done there, but nothing substantial where I'd have anybody like
Has
jump
to be
on
there.
board right away. Yeah,
Got it. Good to
yeah,
know.
yeah.
Thoughts on naps during the day?
Um, Naps are there's some good uses for naps, right? Like, there's it's short-term boost, and it can make up for a lack of sleep at night. It can give a short-term cognitive boost. It can be useful in certain circumstances. I think like where you run into issues is, well, one, why they're napping, right? So like I think, knowing that, like making sure the athlete's aware like 6 hours of sleep at night plus 2 hours of sleep in a nap is not the same as 8 hours of sleep. When you think about those progressions of sleep cycles, you're getting different proportions of different sleep cycles as the night goes on. It's not completely uniform. And so that's important to note out. So like in a nap, you're not going to have those same, rhythm of cycles. And so that's just not how it works. So I think, the importance of that big chunk of sleep at night is has to be kind of really valued from a coaching perspective. And then understanding that naps can be useful. It's more of a short-term boost. It's not a long-term. It's more as a band-aid. It can be really useful and helpful. But the other thing is if they're not getting a lot of sleep, and then that then in turn the nap impacts that sleep that night. Now we're talking about a waterfall in the multiple days. And so,
Mm,
again, being intentional with a little bit of education on why they're napping, and I would use it as a tool to get through certain situations. But that being said, if someone's a really good napper and it's part of their routine and they're getting ample amount of sleep at night, like for example, like there's a lot of swimmers, my wife included, slept 8 hours a night, had a really hard morning practice. They did doubles, would take a nap every single day during training, come back in the night and have another practice. So I think it's more about consistency, knowing they can take a nap. It's not going to impact that night's sleep because that night sleep is like the golden goose.
okay. Got it. Good to know. So it can curb some of the negative side effects, but generally not a great
Yeah.
habit to get into, it sounds like.
Yeah. And I
Okay.
think I think too, like in that's where sleep is really interesting because it's not like there's there's a bunch of data out there. There's a bunch of studies. Like there's studies on like everything we're talking about. But I think the individual component of this stuff, like it's not because sleep has such a psychological component of it, like being the relaxation, being able to sleep, and the worry involved around sleep. It creates this psychological component that I think that's unique to study, right? Like because we talk about strength conditioning, performance oriented studies, it's kind of like a singular. It's a much easier to isolate a component, and I think sometimes like we were talking about this earlier, there's some conceptual things that you have to piece together because it's a multiple um, a multiple variable situation. It's like sleep isn't just sleep. There's a lot of things that surround sleep. There's a lot of psychological components. There's a lot of consistency and situational components that this revolves around. So things could work for some person like a nap that don't work great for another. But at the end of the day, though, if an athlete is like underslept and dragging, like you're not going to tell them not to take a nap. Like I don't want to
Mm,
get. We're
yeah.
talking about like if people are doing the right things the majority of the time.
Cool. Got it. That's wonderful to know.
Yeah.
So I'll end us there just because we're at time. I know everybody's got busy schedules and such. So Todd, where can people find you? Where can people interact with you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm on Instagram the most, just Todd Anderson, 42, and I love, communicating, helping people anyway. Like that's why I get into this. So if anybody has any questions, would love to help in any way.
Sweet. Love it. And then, shameless plug here for Todd. I use his products and such, sleep mask, mouth tape, nasal
Yeah,
strips, all of it as part of my bedtime routine. And seriously, guys, feel like whatever you like, whatever you end up going with, having that routine
yeah.
has been an X factor for me as someone who struggled with sleep for a lot of their life.
Yeah, we
So
work
that
with quite a few like pro and college teams where we'll like do custom logo mat all of our products, and then usually I'll come in as part of that and kind of connect the dots with some of the products, and we get really cool buy-in. But most most of our consumers or customers are general pop, but I love working with athletes, and that's kind of why we got into this. So anything I can do to help, always here.
Love it. Cool, everyone. Well, thanks for attending today and be on the lookout for the next one. All right. Really appreciate you all being here. And
Thanks,
thank you,
guys.
Todd. Later,
See ya.
y'all.